So let me start by just saying it's a real pleasure to be here today, particularly with this esteemed group of panelists who I count among my dear friends and the colleagues who I look to most to help inform my own work. So I think we're all here today because we have, both through lived experience and our own reading of the research and practice, come to this sense that what we've known for millennia now, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Yet much of the policy and practice of the last couple decades has failed to reflect that. What I want to do, just to help kick off this panel, is to tell you about two studies that I've been part of with my colleagues here that have tried to better understand through large-scale quantitative approach to studying the relationship between school environments and teacher turnover and student achievement, the ways in which the whole is in fact greater than the sum of its parts. And the first is one where, along with John Pape and Susan Moore Johnson, we tried to better understand the relationship among these three factors across schools in Massachusetts. The second is a study with two colleagues at Harvard where we focused more narrowly in New York City on the middle schools over a period of 5 years and examined when we observed changes in teachers' perceptions of their work environments, of the school climate. What types of corresponding changes did we observe in teacher turnover and student achievement? We have seen in studies over the last several decades patterns of teacher turnover where teachers are more likely to leave schools that serve larger portions of low-income and minority students, and some scholars have interpreted this as a signal of teachers' preferences with whom they work. And in this first paper, what we do is we try to add to that narrative the competing hypothesis that, in fact, it's not choices based on the students whom they teach, but the environment in which those students are often forced to learn. And in fact, when you do an analysis to try to understand and explain the variation in teachers' self-reported satisfaction of their experience on the job, measures of their working conditions derived from surveys about their experiences are far stronger predictors of their satisfaction than a whole host of measures of students' characteristics and the demographics of those who attend a school, kind of showing with, I think, empirical rigor the fact that teachers often strive to serve those students most in need of their support, but need to have the environment in which they're able to succeed. Also from my work with John and Susan, in looking across schools in Massachusetts, what we find, even after trying to compare schools that are quite similar in terms of the students they serve and in the location in the state and their size, that teacher intent to transfer away from their school but remain in the profession, so looking to seek to teach somewhere else, is strongly predicted by their working conditions. If you look here, particularly at this lower tail of the working conditions measure that we use, derived from the New Teacher Center's kind of widely used survey, that is a composite index measure of a whole host of different characteristics of the school environment, things like the quality of the leadership, the degree of collaboration among teachers, the quality and degree of mutual respect and trust among colleagues, that it's particularly in these schools where teachers perceive there to be very low quality working conditions that they're most likely to intend to transfer away from those schools. We also, in that paper, examine the relationship across schools between teachers' working conditions and student growth percentiles at the school level and find a strong relationship there. And in following up on that, I'm going to focus on the results in the second paper that examined both the relationship between working conditions and turnover, as well as the relationship between working conditions and student achievement. And in the second paper, the idea here is that there may be a whole host of other reasons that are related to the school's work environment that might also explain some of the patterns we observe when we look across schools. And so in order to try to follow up on the hypotheses that have been generated both from that prior work and a whole host of really rich case study, qualitative, in-depth work by Susan Moore Johnson and others that really point to the salience of these factors, that if we can actually observe change over time within individual schools. And so what we're able to do is we're able to leverage data from the New York City Department of Education school survey, which outside of the decennial census is one of the largest annual surveys ever conducted in the United States. And they do this annually with teachers, parents, and students. And we leverage data primarily from teachers, but replicate our findings largely with the student self-reports as well. And what we model is, do we observe changes in teacher turnover when in fact the school's climate is perceived to have changed as reported by the teachers? One would expect that we would if in fact the school climate was impacting teachers' career decisions and students' achievement. And what we're showing you here is kind of a graphical representation of what we see as our preferred results, the model that we think is most robust to alternative explanations for why we would see this relationship. And so the 4 measures that we derive from the survey that the NYDOE administers are a construct that kind of conflates 2, I think, conceptually different things, but in the data they seem to cohere together: the quality of the leadership and the professional development in the school, academic expectations that teachers and staff have for the students in a school, the quality of relationships and collaboration among the staff, and the degree to which the school is safe and provides an orderly learning environment for students. And across all of these measures, each one independently, even holding constant or separate from the other dimensions of the school environment, are strong and statistically significant predictors of a teacher's decision to leave the school. So let me help you interpret some of these numbers here. Here we have the predicted probability of a teacher transferring. And so because each of these are conditional on each other, you can, if one were to successfully realize, for example, a 1 standard deviation improvement on each of these 4 measures, you would predict, based on our results, a corresponding decrease of about 3.5 percentage points in teacher turnover. Among middle schools in New York City, there's about a 15% annual turnover rate. So that's about a fourth of the total annual turnover rate that we observe in these schools. A meaningful amount. We've talked about turnover itself as wanting to know more about who leaves, and I think this is one area that's really ripe for future research. Is here we're focusing in aggregate about overall turnover rates, but certainly we think that losing some teachers has a different effect than losing others. And so I really kind of want to, in my future work and with my colleagues, explore the ways in which there may be differential turnover and who responds to these different changes in working conditions and who decides to stay and who leaves. The next figure shows our results from analyses of the relationship between changes in these 4 measures of school climate with their relationship to students' achievement on the state standardized tests in math and ELA. And what we see here is that particularly for our measure of safety and order, that when students are able to be in class that is orderly and they're not concerned about their well-being and their safety, they're able to concentrate on their academics, and that schools that make meaningful improvements in their environment around this dimension also see corresponding improvements in student achievement in both math and in reading. Now, not all of these measures are statistically significant, and in fact, the magnitudes of these are fairly modest. So I want to be very clear that we're not talking about a silver bullet here. This is not something that we're going to take an arrow out of our quiver, that if in fact these relationships are causal, going to dramatically and overnight change the scale of student achievement. But I think they've been largely marginalized as even contributing to the process of student learning, and having them as part of the conversation is really key. To give you a sense about the magnitude here, if we were in a school to realize a standard deviation increase in the quality of these 4 measures concurrently, we would predict that that would correspond to about 0.05 standard deviation change in student achievement in math, which is approximately equivalent to about a month's worth of learning, to help give you a sense of what that is. So what are the big takeaways here? And this, I think, draws on both of the studies that we've talked about, as well as other work that I've been a part of with John and Susan in the literature that I've read in doing that work. First, I think we need to recognize that working conditions, more so than student characteristics, shape teachers' career decisions. And I think that matters a lot because we talk about policies for staffing hard-to-staff schools and thinking about how we attack that problem. And if we frame that problem as just teachers not wanting to work with those students, and the policy solutions are very different than a challenge of improving the environments in which the teachers are forced to work and the students are obliged to learn. The second point I want to make is that many of the working conditions that matter most are those that are least responsive to top-down legislation or administrative regulation. And that's not to say that they aren't responsive to interventions, but it's that approaches to improving the school work conditions that are primarily dictated through kind of top-down policy avenues are unlikely, I think, to be realized in practice in schools. That this is about collective effort among professionals in a school building to engage in a process of continual improvement. Third, that principals play a key role in establishing conditions for a strong climate, and that offers a clear, actionable policy level for human resource departments to target and develop the skills of principals who are able to, as we heard earlier, develop relationships and galvanize collective support. But it is essential that they bring those skills to bear to actually bring about collective action. That is, without that collective support, no individual is going to be able to move the needle on something that adheres in the social interactions of a group. Also, that successful school turnaround efforts really require a focus on both the individual as well as the organizational effectiveness. And I think we've had a narrow perception of how we might improve struggling schools, and what I hope that the research you hear today in this panel helps to convince you of is that both go hand in hand in addressing some of the gravest challenges we face as educators. And to wrap up quickly, I see real potential to use data from the emerging use of school climate survey measures to help inform schools and leaders about where they might target their efforts. That the school climate is a large and sometimes amorphous concept, but these survey measures are developing in the science and helping to potentially target areas for intervention. And that I really want to emphasize that we still know very little about the efficacy of actual interventions to improve the school climate and whether or not those efforts would in fact have the causal impacts that the research to date suggests that they might. And so it's really beholden to the researchers to work with practitioners to learn about what interventions they're using, what they find effective, and to study why those are effective. With that, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.